As I've been doing some fairly intensive research into basically every era of NBA history recently, I made a point to pay mind to the names that I would hear that you aren't really anticipating hearing. Like through the 80s, you're expecting to hear a lot about Bird and Magic, but what about, for example, Sidney Moncrief? So I figured it would be a great time to go ahead and make a video on who I think the most underrated player from each era is, someone who through time we have not given quite enough credit to, usually because they were just not at the forefront of the conversation in their era, but they deserve their flowers too. So let's get into it. Real quick, before I get into this video, if you're enjoying it, please be sure to subscribe. Also drop a like. It only takes 1 second and it makes a massive difference. Also, just gonna say out of the gate, I don't have a pick for the 1950s. That was segregation ball and I have zero respect for it. Plenty of the 60s was as well, but I'll at least give some credit to Walt Bellamy, who is my pick for the most underrated player of the 60s. Walt was another player of the 60s who put up really big numbers, which was really indicative of that era. At his peak, which was ironically at his rookie year, which weirdly happens a lot at this time in history, the amount of times when you look at the basketball reference of a player from the 60s and like all of their really impressive numbers are at the front and then they fall off. I guess just players got career-ending injuries more often, but very odd how much that was a thing. As a rookie, Bellamy averaged 31 and 19. He put up 27 and 16 and a half rebounds for his first 5 seasons in the league, averaged 23 and 15 for the era as a whole. Not a lot to say about him as a player. He was a fairly stereotypical big man, but ultimately a super dominant one. He had a funky mid-range shot. He was also a hell of an offensive rebounder, even though this is so far ago in NBA history that they weren't even counting offensive rebounds yet. Well, they were counting them as rebounds, but they didn't bother to differentiate. But yeah, obviously there were plenty of better centers in the 1960s, and that's exactly why Walt Bellamy got overshadowed. For the 1970s, I'm gonna go with John Havlicek, who honestly might just be the most underrated player of all time, period. He's been my pick in the past, and maybe that would change if I looked into it in more depth, but he's a really good answer for that question. He won rings with the 1960s Celtics as a sixth man, but he played his best ball individually in the 1970s, becoming the Celtics' best player in the 70s, where he would win 2 championships as that best player. Nobody talks about those championships or, well, the 1970s at all, really. One thing that stands out about the 1970s is just a shocking lack of narrative or like superstars to follow, really. A lot of guys were over in the ABA, and it was just a very weird time for the NBA. But that said, in that weird time, the Celtics won some championships, which I think might actually surprise a couple of you, because the way that we talk about the Boston Celtics and their championships, we essentially divided up into 3 eras. There was the Big 3 in 2008, then there was the Larry Bird era, and then there was the Bill Russell era. But there are 2 championships that the Celtics won in there as well, where John Havlicek was the best player for one of them, and he was too old to be the best player for the second one, but he was Finals MVP in 1974. In that final series, he averaged 26, 7, and 5, as well as 2 steals, beating Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's Western Conference Milwaukee Bucks, because of course that makes sense. Milwaukee is so far on the West Coast. He was a really versatile all-around forward, a good playmaker, good scorer, good mid-range shot, could dribble the ball, could be an off-ball player, capable defender, good rebounder. Really, he just did it all. He averaged 22, 6, and 6 for the 70s as a whole, and in his 3-year peak, he averaged 27, 8, and 7, which is pretty similar to the career numbers of another small forward I've heard of. For the 1980s, I had to go with a tie here. There were 2 guys guys who were just so deserving of a spotlight that I figured I would just go with both of them. And ironically, both of these guys kind of sit on either ends of the spectrum in how they were underrated. These two players are Sidney Moncrief and Alex English. For Alex English, he's probably underrated because his numbers don't necessarily jump out at you, and his team was always coming second or third place in his own conference. And in the case of Sidney Moncrief, he puts up crazy impressive numbers, but there was not a history of winning there. On offense, he was a knockdown mid-range shooter, a really athletic slasher, and a good playmaker and ball handler. He averaged 21, 6, and 5 while being the best guard defender in the league at his peak. Sidney Moncrief is also the only guard to ever win 2 DPOYs, actually winning the first DPOY in NBA history. Obviously, part of that is just that they didn't have the precedent for the award, which would quickly become it's a big man basically every year. But Sidney was that dude defensively, and if you're looking for an all-time perimeter defender, he's one of them. And on top of that, with Sidney being the starter and the team's lead player for many years, they did not see a season with less than 50 wins until the 87-88 season. They also had decent playoff success, but they unfortunately could never ever handle the Boston Celtics. Sidney was honestly like the Jimmy Butler of his era to me, at least that's the vibe that I get. Now, who I would not describe as that type of player would be Alex English, because Alex was just a bona fide bucket, and that was mostly it. I'm not going to go into a crazy amount of depth with him for the sake of time, but to put it simply, the dude could just score. In fact, in the 1980s, no one scored more points than Alex English did. He averaged 26 points, 6 rebounds, and 4.5 assists for the decade as a whole. He never got all that much help though. He really never had a good defense around him, so he only made the conference finals 1 time, and he lost to the Showtime Lakers in 5. History is written by the victors. For the 1990s, I'm gonna have to go with Mitch Richmond. Mitch was just a walking bucket. It's really as simple as that. You know, Reggie Miller gets a ton of credit for dominating with the 3-point shot so early when that obviously wasn't a very prevalent thing in the 1990s, but there were other players in his era doing that, top among them being Mitch. For the era, he shot 4 3-pointers a game. At his peak, he shot 6.4 a game in 96. The Kings that year took 14.5 3-point attempts a game, making his 3-point attempts 44% of the team's 3-point attempts. If we took that equivalent dominance individually of a team shooting into a modern context, that percentage of the average 3-point volume today would mean Mitch was taking the equivalent of 15 3-pointers a game in his era. For the 90s as a whole, he averaged 23, 4, and 4, shot 39% from 3 on 4 attempts per game. In his best individual season in 97, he averaged 26, shooting 6 threes a game on 43% shooting. For the 2000s, this answer was kind of easy for me. I know a lot of people like to pick Chris Webber for this one, but honestly, I think Amari Stoudemire has a case for being better than Chris and truly the power forward of the 2000s that was most screwed over by being a power forward in the 2000s and having KG, Dirk, and Tim Duncan to compete with. Amari was just really fucking good, and in a way that I don't think he gets enough credit for. His numbers of 21 and 9 for the era might not jump out at you, but at his absolute peak, he averaged 26 and 9, and he was just remarkably devastating in the pick and roll. Maybe the greatest lob target of all time, just absolutely punches the ball into the rim, super strong, and you just don't want to see that guy running towards you with Steve Nash setting him up. But as much as Amari sticks out as a play finisher, he was also way more capable of creating his shot than I think people and history really remember. He had a ton of finesse to his game. He had really creative finishes. He was a deadly mid-range shooter at times, having a couple of seasons where he shot well above league average on high efficiency. He also had pretty decent handle, which he'd utilize pretty often because he was a lot faster than most centers. He was also a complete and super underrated playoff riser. As I mentioned, he averaged 21-9 in the regular season in the 2000s. Bump that up to 25-10 for his playoff averages, including a 30-11 average in a Western Conference Finals run, where he averaged 37-10 in that conference finals against a prime Tim Duncan. As is a common theme with these guys, he consistently was a part of teams that just were not quite good enough to beat teams that we know much better because they beat them, but they really were competitive for a couple of years and had a legit shot at the title, and a lot of that was because Amar'e Stoudemire was just insanely good. A lot of the way that people talk about that team is like Steve Nash, and he's just nice enough to set up his teammate Amar'e Stoudemire, but Amar'e went on to the Knicks. This is obviously post 2010, but he went to a separate team and put up 26-10. The guy just would be great in any context, for real. Steve Nash did not make him in any capacity, and I hate that argument. And finally, for the 2010s, no, I'm not going to be making a pick for the 2020s, only 3 years in. So for the 2010s, I'm going to go with Blake Griffin because it already feels like we're starting to forget about him. I think his career is recent enough that he hasn't fully faded from the public conscious, but you can feel it coming. Blake ultimately suffered from his own success, specifically in the realm of dunking. Being one of the best dunkers of all time is kind of a double-edged sword because it really sucks being known and labeled as just a dunker, but Blake was one of the most skilled power forwards this game has ever seen. Super strong handle and passing ability. He eventually developed a reliable mid-range game to space out the floor, and even a good three-point shot in the latter half of the 2010s. He averaged 22-9 and 4.5 on league average efficiency. He was an all-star as a rookie, which has not happened since he did it in 2010. And weirdly enough, while he will rightfully be remembered as a Clipper forever, the Lob City era is just easily the most iconic thing that he ever took a part of. The best Blake Griffin ever was as a basketball player came on the Detroit Pistons in 2019. He averaged 24.5 points, 7.5 rebounds, and 5.5 assists, shooting 36% from 3 on 7 attempts per game. Just 3 seasons before this one, he was attempting 0.5 threes a game. Injuries unfortunately took the wind out of his sails, both shortening his career as well as being the main catalyst in a lack of playoff success year after year. I know people like to clown on those Clippers a lot because it's the Clippers and Chris Paul is associated with them, but more often than not, injuries were the reason why the team ended up being disappointing. With that said, shout out to Rudy for editing this video, and go ahead and tell me who you think is the most underrated player of each era, or maybe you passionately feel about one player for one era and you want to tell me. Whatever it may be, I'll be in the comments. But yeah, that's it. See you later.